On the show today, we'll track the ease of doing business in Africa. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets, and you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther Ubodaga. Now, with countries on the continent actively working to improve their business ecosystems, we've seen many reforms being implemented. Now, following Nigeria's recent National Action Plan, the ease of doing business in Africa has been on the front burner of many conversations within the African community. So we ask, what is the ease of doing business in Africa? Joining me now for this discussion is Cemile Hacibeyoglu. She's a senior private sector specialist at the World Bank Group. Cemile, thank you so much. Pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me, Esther.
So the ease of doing business for Nigeria has been a good story, but before we go into how Nigeria has been successfully implementing some of its reforms, this year marks the 15th year since the ease of doing report of the World Bank was put together, and I know that it's dramatically reformed the way Africans do business here on the continent. But help us understand how dramatic these changes have been.
Yeah. Let me just start with introducing what the Doing Business Index does and measures. I think you just mentioned that it has been the 15th anniversary, last year's edition that came out in October. But this is an annual publication of the World Bank Group that measures ease of doing business and benchmarks economies according to how easy or difficult it is to do business in these economies. Currently, it measures 190 economies across the globe, but when it started 15 years ago, it was just looking at a little over 130 economies, and it wasn't even capturing the whole spectrum of different areas of business operations that apply to small and medium enterprises. Today, the report looks at areas that relate to the small and medium enterprises, the daily lives of these enterprises, if you wish, from starting a business to paying taxes to trading across borders to all the way to if you have to go to courts or even be bankrupt. So if you wish, it's a very good barometer of how the business environment is in a given economy. And of course, if you do put out such a public tool in the public space, countries are very interested to see how they compare, how they fare compared to their peers, compared to their neighbors. And we have seen this report directly really encourage and incentivize countries to reform and do better in their business environment. So globally, it has been, it really has played that role in encouraging countries to improve their business environment, but very much so in Africa as well.
Well, I know that for Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, the region continues to lag other regions when it comes to implementing some of these reforms. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head with that. Africa still does, on average, sub-Saharan Africa still does have the lowest average as the region. The average is about 143 out of 190 economies. So as you can see, there's definitely room for improvement. But it's not about where we are today as the region, it's about the journey when it comes to, especially when you analyze the trends. If you looked at what was happening about 10 years ago, you would only see 3 out of 10 economies improving. Today, it's 8 out of 10 economies improving. So 36 out of 48 economies each year introduce at least, for the past 3 years or so, introduce at least one reform that make it easier for businesses to do, to operate within their economies. And what does it say? It means that African economies have put economic diversification, private sector-led growth at the heart of their competitiveness agendas.
So would you say that that has been the major problem why the region has lagged, the major challenges why it's been that way?
I think that from where the region is coming,
coming from a
lower place compared to others, in that sense, the journey will be longer. But I think the progress we have made, it certainly is one of the best. In terms of number of reforms, we do top every other region. The only other more active region is actually Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And if you look a little bit into trends and the reasons for that, they're very much incentivized by policies promoted by or sort of driven by joining the EU and all the other sort of funding and incentives associated with that. But Africa on its own has really come a long way in increasing this reform pace and really seizing this moment and understanding the importance of private sector-led growth for competitiveness of the continent.
Do you think that conversation, putting the private sector at the center of business in especially driving economic reforms, do you think that this is a message that is resonating across the continent?
Very much so, very much so. And we're seeing this throughout the numbers, as I said. Actually, this past year, the 15th edition of the report, we saw a record high number of reforms across the continent. It was 83 reforms. We haven't seen this number. It was actually, the year before was what we thought was a record with 80. This year, 83, and I just think there were only ways up. As I said, the number, it's not just the number of reforms, so the pace, but it's also the number of economies. So we are reaching out, or, you know, even post-conflict economies, smaller economies, or big economies. We're in Nigeria now. Big economies that didn't used to think about this kind of reforms are also working in this direction. So definitely the trend is very positive.
So what is it that has distinguished or distinguishes those countries that have been successful, that have that momentum, from those who don't?
So these countries realize the importance of economic growth, and they realize the importance of having a business environment that is conducive for businesses to thrive. So they realize that it's not just about investment or, you know, resource-driven growth, but it's also about, you know, your average citizen and their interactions with the government. Because in most developing economies in the world, about 90% of jobs, they come from small and medium enterprises. So you can't really be talking about growth in developing economies if you don't address the business environment for small and medium enterprises.
But it's easier to implement many of these reforms in an economy that has low poverty and unemployment levels.
It gets more complex, of course, with the levels of capacity of the government, with the levels of sort of, you know, vision of the government. It does get more difficult. So I think Africa's context in that sense, perhaps maybe bringing back to your original point of why are we so behind, why? I think the starting point is a bit low in that sense. But I want to say that the pace is really, we are outpacing the other regions in the way we're doing and the determination with which we're working.
So there's opportunity for leapfrogging.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's bring it back home. Let's talk about Nigeria. Nigeria, in the last 3 years at least, has embarked on some aggressive reforms. The National Action Plan 2.0, now 3.0, just 3.0 just completed. Short impact-driven initiatives targeted at SMEs. And I know that you worked closely with a team that put this together, that's driving this, and we've seen, I've had one of the team members, and it's been positives all the way from, you know, registering a business to access to credit. But I know that Nigeria also has some, you know, peculiar challenges, and I know that there are, you know, challenges that are similar to other countries across the board. But share your experience working with the Nigerian team, especially with the National Action Plan 3.0, or the entire initiative itself.
So first of all, just to say that, to recognize that I've been working in Nigeria for several years now, even prior to this administration. So definitely what you've just said about the last 2-3 years under the establishment of the PEBIC, Presidential Enabling Business Environment Council, and the EBIS, Enabling Business Environment Secretariat, things have really taken a different turn. And I think just to recognize here the importance of the leadership and commitment of the government. And if I had to tell you what would be sort of the common success factors of economies that have done well. I mean, we're looking at Nigeria moving 24 places in a year on the ease of doing business, which is, you know, a significant effort. But, you know, it's not specific to Nigeria in the sense that if you look at countries that have done so well, yes, it is unique to have that kind of movement. But what did Nigeria do together with other countries that have done very well, like Mauritius, like Colombia, like Russian Federation, like India, that have reformed in a similar way? They've taken this issue very seriously at the very top level of the government. So that's what the structure really has enabled. And when it comes to the NAP, the National Action Plans, I think they're also very interesting ways of sort of accelerate reform efforts. We have similar countries that I work on in the region have done that. I know in the past, I believe Liberia did that. I know Zimbabwe has done something similar. Like they say, we have a 100-day period through which we're going to accelerate it. NAP, of course, is looking at 60-day period. So we've seen very good impact of this work. And of course, worked NAP 1, NAP 2, and now NAP 3, delivering significant results. And I think what it does is government sets itself a measurement, right? And it tells us a benchmark. this is what I want to deliver. I'm going to measure that ahead of any outside assessment. Because what we do, we conduct the survey once a year, and it's either a surprise or not a surprise, depending how you look at it. A lot of countries wake up that day and say, I just disagree with that. But if you do these kind of assessments throughout the year several times, you're actually keeping a tab on what you're doing. And you know, if you didn't deliver well on NAP 2, you know what you need to push through on the third version. So I think that strategy has been very winning. There's been very critical in our work here.
I imagine it was also a complicated process because for the government, they're not just changing the systems and processes, they're also changing mindsets. And I remember I asked that question too, how it was, I mean, carrying people, because, you know, especially the public service, like here in Nigeria, very huge, and there's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, and then you wake up one morning and you say, okay, we have a 3-month timeline, we want to actually, accomplish A, B, C, D, and this is, and then these are systems that people are not used to, and, you know, habits die hard, as it were. So share your experience.
No, and I think you've said it earlier as well. I mean, Nigeria is specifically context-wise a challenging environment. I mean, you're looking at different levels, right? You're looking at federal level, you're looking at state level, you're looking at local level, and, you know, we don't just look at sort of the legislation you pass, we look at practice. So if you want to talk about successful reform implementation, we need to be able to reach out on the guy on the street here in Lagos, you know, either in Ikeja or the guy in Kano, and make sure the reform that you've done, be it the reform with the Corporate Affairs Commission or be it the reform that you've done at the port, that they have reached that guy. So we are talking about definitely changing a lot of old habits, definitely changing mindset, but I think the consistency is what really plays a key role here. As I said, high-level determination, making sure that everybody, you know, state governments are involved. They're very much a part, as you know, the SPEBEC structure. It meets every month, and at a very high level, the state governments are represented. So the message is passed at a very high level, and it does trickle down. So yes, challenges, they do exist. And we also realize in this work that this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. We never thought that we will be reforming Nigeria, or any country that wants to reform, you know, in their right mind would know that you cannot do it overnight. You cannot do it with results just in 1 year. Even if you do strong improvement in 1 year, it's really a key challenge to actually sustain this for the upcoming year. It shows how serious and determined you are. So I think this upcoming year for us in Nigeria will be a key one, because first year, I would say, at the risk of sounding, you know, maybe a bit provoking, that first year is always, you know, compared to others is easier, right? Because you're starting at a lower place. Now you've improved. You've reaped all your low-hanging fruits. Now you have to deal with the more challenging and systematic reforms.
That is a key point. The low-hanging fruits, most of them have been plucked already.
I wouldn't say, I think there's, see, in Nigeria, because of the context, even the lowest hanging fruit is not always very easy to reap, to pluck. So in that sense, it has been. So I would say this year is a critical one. In that sense, the NAP 3 phase that we're just coming out now, I think has delivered very good and solid results.
Okay. Cemile, hold that thought for us. We're going to talk in depth about the 3.0 and the others. So we'll take a short break and we'll be right back to pick up from where we left off. I've been speaking to Cemile Hacibeyoglu, Senior Private Sector Specialist at the World Bank. Still with me in the studio is Cemile Hacibeyoglu. She's a Senior Private Sector Specialist at the World Bank Group, and we're tracking the ease of doing business in Africa. Thank you so much, Cemile, for your time so far. Let's get right down into the nitty-gritty. Some of the indicators that Nigeria focused on with the NAP 3.0 initiative, getting credit, paying taxes, and moving goods across the country. Those are some of the issues, you know, that are at the heart of this. But sometimes I also think about the structural issues in Nigeria. I mean, bad roads, we're talking about moving goods. But I remember I've been told that some of them are soft infrastructure, like registering a business. That's the things you get to do online, not physically. But talk us through that.
Yeah. So I think here maybe I should start by talking about the premise of what exactly we look at. Essentially, we want to simplify the citizens' interaction with the government. So if you're making me run 12 different places to transfer property, to register a property, you're far from efficient. There are places in the world who do this online, who do this very fast, right? So we are trying to see how you can make it efficient, more transparent, and make it more affordable for the citizens, for end users to actually use the government system. So sometimes it relates to infrastructure and big investment, but sometimes it's all about, taking some administrative actions, simplifying some things. I'll give you some very specific examples, like the reforms in the area of company registration to the Corporate Affairs Commission. For as long as I've known myself and been working in Nigeria, it's been always a reform that was coming. It's a silver bullet. It's going to be all electronic. We need to wait for it, and it's coming, and it's coming. Sometimes you just don't have time to wait, and you have to maximize and streamline processes without kind of waiting for the electronic solutions. And removing, for example, removing the requirement to go to a notary or a lawyer, because the representatives of the CAC actually can play that role, and it's actually cheaper. This is a very good way to simplify the process. Moving the process, committing to making the registration within 24 hours. It's actually something I'm very excited about that we really hope will come through the report and validated this year. And, it wasn't an easy process. When we were starting this about a year and a half ago, and I remember doing some tours in some of the other cities, certainly I remember being in Kano and Lagos, communicating these changes, and even doing the demo of the portal, we were running into issues and the glitches. And you can't wait for a magic solution and investment to kind of solve all these problems. Well, what they've done is they bought some more RAM and memory space to allow for more operation, for more applications to go through. And, it's running now within, I was just in Abuja, and they told me that about 90% of all applications within the entire country are actually handled within 24 hours. So that's impressive. So you have to think of solutions like that. Another example is simplification of the property registration process here in Lagos and in other cities that we look at. Essentially, moving things, automating the records. If you want to look at your if you want to transfer property, you want to see who it belongs to. It shouldn't be taking you days. The more you streamline this information, you automate it, I can have access to it very quickly, and I can move along with my day very fast. So there's been a lot of efforts, especially in the areas of construction permits, where there's also been some cost reduction on certain procedures.
Sorry to bother you. Is there a consciousness of the role that technology also plays in all of this?
Absolutely.
Because that's a big part of this now. And we have no choice. We have to run with it.
Because every time you move to electronic format, you automate, you're actually reducing any chance for me to interact with the government official. And it's simpler and easier for me. Just this morning, we had a very nice discussion with the private sector, and every measure that we would be recommending, would resonate with them, because it's just the common sense. Make it faster, make it simpler. Don't make me go to 25 different places for one step, for simple procedure that I could be doing electronically. So the good thing is that mindset and mentality change that you talked about earlier, it's coming here. Now, I don't have to say it several times. The government agencies, the MDAs, they're actually picking on that and say, okay, hold on, let me see. Before we actually move to electronic, let me see if I can just send it by email. So this is a way to streamline and make things more efficient. And I think definitely that mindset shift has come to Nigeria.
How often does the government have engagements with the private sector? Because obviously feedback is key. And if you're going to be making the processes as you go along, you need that kind of input.
All the time. It's a very critical part of the assessment. Private sector is at the heart of this work. There is no reform unless the end user of this has actually felt it, understood it, and has used it. You can do all you want, electronic payments. You can, like the example of the paying taxes actually, one of the reforms that has been introduced and finalized under NAP 3 was actually the e-filing, the electronic filing of taxes. We've had that for years, but there was no uptake because people haven't heard about it, people haven't been using it, people didn't know about it. Now, just had a meeting with FIRS colleagues a few days ago in Abuja. Last year, out of 9,000 filers, 7,000 were in electronic format. And this March alone, there were 12,000 filers. So this is a great improvement in the uptake. And it's definitely due to the engagement with the private sector. And through my work here, of course, I know that this has been done at a very high level, but also at a very technical level. Quarterly Business Forum, as you know, is a platform where, the President, His Excellency the President, as well as the various ministers interact with the private sector at the highest level, but also us, the enabling business Environment Secretariat, and the technical team engages private sector.
Should it always be led by the top? We have states, we have local governments. These are the closest to people, to the SMEs.
I think it has to be top down and bottom up. I think every approach is really necessary here. I think overall in setting the tone of the agenda, commitment and determination from top is key. And I think that is what has been driving the success in the case of Nigeria. Interacting with private sector, though, really, it's not always easy for them to speak up and talk about their problems in the presence of very senior people. So you have to do them at very different levels, technical agency level, as well as mid-level, and the teams have been doing that here.
I know that one sticking point, though, in all of this, apart from registering business and other indicators, is the ports in Nigeria. It's so complicated, and I know that successive governments have actually failed in trying to just get the systems and processes. You think you've solved one thing and then something else comes up, and there's so many agencies fighting for, I don't know, relevance, supremacy, or whatever you want to call it. So how is it now? How have these reforms impacted on that?
So it's interesting that you mentioned the ports, because actually it's one of the areas where we had difficulty gaining traction in our work in the previous year or two. And I'm very, one of the reasons it's actually more complicated because it involves a lot of stakeholders. I mean, you're not just talking to customs, you're talking also Ministry of Finance, you're talking customs broker, you're talking about freight forwarders, you're talking about the police, you're talking about various ministries, the phytosanitary guys who need to inspect the goods. So you're talking about a whole variety of different actors. So here what happened actually this year, we are seeing some traction. And one of the very good examples that I'm happy that I heard came as a result of NAP3 is the extension of operating hours at the Papa port to 24 hours. So the customs was open before, but the port was open from 7 to 7. So you could actually technically clear, but you had to sit and wait for the hours to come in for you to clear the goods. So now it's no longer the case. So this is important, and this really came through this momentum of reform that is happening in the country in general. And the second example is, I think it applies again to the multitude of stakeholders, is single joint inspection. I mean, you would pass your goods and then the police would come, I don't know who would come, the customs would come, the other agency would come. Each time you stop, each time you lose money. Your business, time is money for you. So what happens now, all the agencies that are supposed to inspect your goods, they actually get notification ahead of time, and they all meet that day when you arrive to the port, they inspect you, and there you go. Then you clear to proceed. So these kind of reforms, they really will make a difference for businesses. And
speaking about making a difference, I know you mentioned this for this point before, being able to ask the man on the street, the SME, the corner, the shop on the corner with 2 or 3 staff, and say, are you feeling the impact of these reforms? With the pace at which we're going, okay, and obviously you cannot give me a definite timeline, but do you think that we could get there sooner than later, to the point where the man on the street will say, yes, I can register a business in 24 hours. It's easier now than ever to get credit or pay my taxes, etc.?
I actually have a surprisingly positive answer to that, because I do spend some time, if not on the street, but definitely in Nigeria, and definitely various cities of Nigeria. And just coming from a public sector stakeholder engagement event in Kano, and just, I didn't even expect anything other than just saying, I was just in Abuja and they told me it's now 24 hours. And they came up and said, yes, it is 24 hours. So this is the kind of testament we're looking for, and I think the more we reach out, the more, we have to reach out so people give us feedback, and this is exactly what we tell us. We are here in this as one team.
And there's a strong feedback mechanism?
Absolutely. The more we meet with the private sector, different levels of engagement, the more we hear from them, the government will fine-tune their work. We will fine-tune our technical work and intervention to make it better and to make it just more responsive to their needs.
Do you have concerns about, because you mentioned earlier about the fact that now we've only seen good traction in the last 3 years, and many times it depends on the administration. And of course, as is with African democracy, sometimes we do see administrations change, and we always suffer the issue of policy somersault, where one government doesn't take it as a priority as the previous government did. Is that a major concern for you?
Look, that's definitely a risk, but in my work so far across the continent, I haven't seen that really to be an issue. As I mentioned earlier on in our discussion, most of the Africans, if not all of the African governments, have put a very important place to private sector-led so business environment, investment climate reforms at their economic competitiveness agenda. So I would say that it will most likely and most probably definitely stay important for all the governments moving forward.
Looking across the African continental landscape and the progress that we've made so far and the ease of doing business, I think you said earlier that there's a better consciousness now of the importance of allowing the private sector to lead economic growth. 10, 15 years from now, are you expecting that momentum to grow, and can we now, looking down the line, would you be able to say, okay, to be at par, the OECD countries or those who have been successful, who have gained so much momentum, that Africa can actually also stand at par and make that kind of progress?
I think it can. The way we're moving, we are the fastest moving continent, but we are, as I said, coming from a lower point. So we have to be faster, we have to go a longer way, and it will really depend on how we integrate the ICT solutions, the technology. I mean, countries like OECD ones, and like to give you an example of New Zealand or Singapore, where you can register your company in half a day, it's all electronic and the cost is minimal, as opposed to some countries that I work with where you have to work in, get a minister's consent, a governor's consent, I don't know what signature. Sometimes a woman cannot do it without her husband's permission. So yeah, you have to, we are moving in that direction, but it also depends on how fast we integrate technological solutions into this work. And sometimes from where we start, streamlining is good, doing what we can administratively is good, but investing in these solutions will also pay off in the medium to long term.
Cemile, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.
It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Pleasure.
I've been speaking to Cemile Hacibeyoglu, Senior Private Sector Specialist at the World Bank Group.